This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Good afternoon and welcome to PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing Forward. I am your host, Brittany Mellinger, and I serve as the Fair Housing Training and Outreach Coordinator at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. In this show, we explore all things housing with the experts, advocates, and community leaders who are working to expand access to housing. Today, we'll be exploring connections between housing and education. It's my pleasure to welcome to the show my colleague Desireé Chang. Desireé Chang serves as the Director of Education and Outreach for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. She has been with the PHRC for 5 years. Prior to becoming the Director of Education and Outreach, she worked as a civil rights mediator with the Mediation Division. During her tenure at the PHRC, Chang has received the 2020 Executive Director of Excellence Award and the 2021 PHRC Social Justice Team Award. She is a graduate of the Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Institute in 2021 and has been recognized for her participation on several committees and community social justice collaborative efforts. She was recently awarded the City and State PA Above and Beyond Award. Chang's educational acquisitions include an Associates of Arts in Criminal Justice, summa cum laude, obtained from Hack Lancaster, as well as a Bachelor of Science in Psychology and Master of Legal Studies from Drexel University, both magna cum laude. She is a member of several academic honor societies. Prior to the PHRC, she worked as an adult probation and parole officer with a specialized caseload of individuals with developmental and mental health disabilities. In addition, she has a background in substance abuse counseling. She has served as a facilitator for trauma-informed responses and has been a certified trainer in motivational interviewing and moral recognition therapy. She enjoys public speaking and volunteering at women's shelters. Much of Chang's professional career has been in roles that include assistance for or advocating of special interest groups. Her passions are married at the PHRC with the ability to educate Pennsylvanians and actively work towards eradicating discrimination, both inside and outside of the Commonwealth. Welcome to PHRC, Director Chang. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we all have a story on how we got to our current work and vocation. Could you share a little bit about your journey towards your current work?
Well, I feel like you said most of it in the bio, but the bio does outline just how I always find myself in advocacy roles. I grew up with a mother that worked in social work, and so I grew up going to Special Olympics and being around adults with developmental disabilities as a child, and just being in that community and seeing advocacy modeled by my mom. I just understood, I think at a very young age, the importance of being able to use your voice or your ability to elevate the voices of others that may not have that opportunity or advantage. So I love doing the work here at the PHRC, and I loved all the roles that I have, but just like the bio outlines, I think this is the best fit thus far because I'm able to elevate a lot of different voices, educate people to feel empowered to advocate for themselves as well as other people. And I think for me, that's just pivotal, and it's just a basic human characteristic. I don't know. It's almost overly simplified, but I think it is. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible to have that kind of a role model and to be able to pursue that in your professional career as well. Could you tell us a little bit about your work as Director of Education and Outreach at PHRC?
Sure. So I think at the PHRC, we are small but mighty is what I say. And so there is a lot of overlap in disciplines and a lot of collaboration. But for the most part, my role would be two primary functions. The one would be to follow the trends and themes in K through 12 and higher education. So things that we're seeing happening, high profile incidents of discrimination, and, partnering with these institutions to educate not only the the faculty and staff, but also to educate the learners in their rights. So that's one role, and then similarly, the other role would be to curate and facilitate training programs, not just in the educational space, but also for organizations that are requesting any types of trainings that would fall under the umbrella or even just be related to anti-discrimination.
So in the Fair Housing Commercial Property Division, we talk a lot about why housing matters so much. It impacts so many aspects of our lives, from the quality of the air that we breathe, to the water we drink, to our options for transportation and access to medical services, to jobs that pay a living wage. But one of the really key aspects is our access to educational opportunities for families with children. Could you talk a little bit about what that looks like for families in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, absolutely. So not Pennsylvania, but housing and education have a direct link to one another. We know that historical constructs dictate what type of educational opportunities are afforded even today. And so we have a variety or a plethora, I guess we'll say, of different demographics here in Pennsylvania. So we have rural communities, we have pockets of metropolitan areas, suburban areas. And so when we're thinking about education and what the demographic of a learner looks like in Pennsylvania, it really does run the gamut. We have 2 HBCUs here housed in Pennsylvania, or historically Black colleges and universities, also known as HBCUs, but we also have the second largest city in the United States, which is Philadelphia, which also happens to be noted as one of the most impoverished cities in the United States. So again, when we're thinking about learners in Pennsylvania, we have to consider all types of demographics, from marginalized identities and populations, because we have all of those, like many states and communities do, but also looking at things from a socioeconomic status, because we have rural, we have suburban, we have city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we really have a little bit of everything here in Pennsylvania. Our housing systems and our educational systems are all shaped by a lot of the decisions that have happened in the past. Could you share specifically about the practice of redlining and how that's had an impact on educational opportunities?
Yeah, so redlining really has created a system of educational inequity. And while we know that it's been outlawed since 1960, we still see the remnants of what redlining did back then today. It still plays out in present day. So things like economic disinvestment and segregation led to the inequitable educational outcomes back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But even today, when we think about funding and our funding formula, which just 2 years ago was determined to have been unconstitutional because we found that there were huge gaps in opportunity for learners based on that funding formula. So redlining created disparities in educational institutions, like from the structures to the resources. So really everything that would impact a learner. So we saw dilapidated buildings, right? We saw resources that were limited, scarce, or non-existent back in the 1960s because of the redlining process. Where money is where the resources then were. And so children that grew up in these communities that were affluent, which also happened to be predominantly white areas, were afforded beautiful buildings, having the latest technology and whatever it was back then, but also we're seeing it even still today. So while we may feel like we're 60 years removed and, having outlawed that redlining process, policies still have yet to be updated to reflect what our society looks like in 2025 and the needs of the various populations in 2025. So we may not call it redlining, but we still understand that funding is dictated by areas, and it's reflective of where communities that need it the most are not always receiving it. And so in turn, the learners within those communities are not receiving equitable education.
Yeah, so you've talked a lot about about disparities by geography as well as by socioeconomic status. Could you share a little bit about that link to children in protected classes, which are children that have protections under our state laws?
When we talk about marginalized identities, so our protected categories are oftentimes the marginalized identities as well. So the groups of learners that are the most significantly and severely impacted are African and Latino students, are also students with disabilities, are also students from immigrant families, and those are just a few. But when we're talking about marginalized identities and the need to recognize what those identities translate to as it relates to education, we have to be willing to see beyond just one type of learner. And we don't always do that, and our systems and structures aren't always designed to do that. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges with our educational system today is that demographics are changing in certain communities and the educational institutions are not following suit. And so these students are put at a disadvantage from the very beginning. And this is where we're seeing systems or generations of poverty happening, because from age 5, we have a huge disparity in what is being offered to one child in one particular district, which would be, if we're going to compare and contrast, if we're looking at an affluent district versus a district that is maybe of a lower socioeconomic status, there are huge gaps in resources that are available, all the way down to technology. So we have communities in Pennsylvania right now. I had mentioned those 3 classifications of students, but we have districts right now in Pennsylvania that 100% of their student population falls within the vulnerable population for the school to prison pipeline. So that's a phenomenon where children with certain identities or particular characteristics are criminalized more so, more harshly, and receiving firmer consequences and given less grace than their counterparts that don't fall into those categories. Right? And so we see that even right now, that there are full districts of over 2,000 students that fall into that population. We need to be addressing the needs of a community to be able to ensure that we're setting these children up for success in looking at them in their humanity. And if it's a student with disabilities, then understanding the types of learning that they need, or the way in which they learn, and being able to afford those resources. It happens in the affluent areas because the money is there, the support is there, right? These communities of lower socioeconomic status oftentimes are single parent households. And so not only is there a limit on financial resources that these families can provide or these parents can provide, but there's a limit on time that they can also provide, where conversely, affluent areas, still present day, 2025, tend to be fully Caucasian areas or predominantly Caucasian areas. There are 2-parent households. And so not only is there a higher level of income that's able to be provided to the schools and supplement teachers, right? But there's also the opportunity for time for the families to be present and engaged and supporting the academics of not just the learner, but of the whole institution.
Yeah, thank you for breaking down some of those impacts and how all of those trends and issues kind of work together. I'd like to talk next about housing stability, because that can impact the success of a learner in a household. I mean, we know that evictions, displacement, and homelessness are really common in our state, even if they're not always visible in every community. Can you talk a little bit about the impacts that has on educational opportunities for children in those households who have been displaced?
Yeah, so children experience displacement for a variety of reasons, right? Sometimes it's an adverse childhood experience that the adults or caregivers are subjecting them to. Sometimes it's migrant families. There's a variety of reasons why a learner or a child might find themselves displaced. But what the research shows is that students that experience displacement have interrupted education, and that interruption in their education creates somewhat of a trickle effect where some students are not able to return to the educational environment for whatever the circumstances were that have created, them being removed from the environment to begin with. So getting back into the educational environment can sometimes be a challenge or a barrier, and then continuing on. So we know that our poverty numbers increased exponentially. I believe it was 3 times just through COVID. Mm-hmm. And we're still trying to rebound from the effects of COVID 5 years later, and we're seeing it in our learners even today.
Yeah, absolutely. An incident like COVID doesn't just go away. The impacts are seen over time. Mm-hmm. So you had mentioned changing demographics a little bit, and I'd love to dive into that a little bit more, because over the recent decades, many communities throughout Pennsylvania have experienced significant demographic change. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that has on schools?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is an obligation for educational institutions to evolve with their surrounding demographic. We don't always see it happen, but if we are truly in pursuit of educational equity, that our law, that the PHRA gives us the jurisdiction to do what we do here at the PHRC, and it dictates that all learners in Pennsylvania have an environment free from discrimination, then that means that we need to look at who are our learners, right? And that does change over time. So we have communities that were historically predominantly Caucasian, and now in 2025, over the course of the last decade, has evolved to over 50, 60, 70% Hispanic. And so we have to recognize those evolutions within our communities and make sure that the educational environment is suited to those students' needs. And it's not just those types of students, but if we're seeing an influx of migrant students, then understanding that, again, it's an educational environment free from discrimination, which means that we have an obligation to provide them with the resources necessary to obtain their education at an equitable rate to their counterparts. Similarly, the same consciousness needs to be applied for students with disabilities as well. So as adults that are dictating the environments for children, it is an obligation that I think that we all have to make sure that we see the children in all of their identities and set them up for success to the best of our ability.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any best practices that you could share on how how schools can respond to these changing needs of changing communities?
Yeah, I think 2 simple fixes, because funding's not always a simple fix, right? We know that it was determined to be unconstitutional 2 years ago, but we still don't have a plan to remedy that. And I recognize that oftentimes is outside of the school's hands. But what schools can do are 2 very easy things. One, creating environments that are inclusive of all types of students. Recognizing if you have an increasing student population that are part of the LGBTQ plus community, and seeing what can be done within that school community to make it a safe and inclusive environment for those identities. Again, students with disabilities, if maybe you've never had a student with a particular type of disability, but you're now having this student a part of that community, then adjusting and pivoting where necessary so that student feels welcomed in who they are. I think the biggest thing that we have to remember is that a lot of the identities that we are privileged in, we didn't ask for, but conversely, the identities that we are oppressed in, we also didn't ask for. And so I think level setting at that base and recognizing that these are children at the mercy of the adults in their environments, and being responsible adults and creating environments that are welcoming for all types of students is incredibly important. So that's one. And we've been saying that for years, right? But I think it's important to put it into practice and looking at, and that's going to change too from district to district because each district looks different. We have over 500 in Pennsylvania. But also making sure that the practices within the school environment are welcoming to families and increasing family engagement. Not always easy, right? In some districts where, as I mentioned, might be single parent households or, the parent or family may need to be at work and things like that. But finding ways, if you recognize that you are in a district with single parent households, maybe offering types of evening events or daytime events that would allow for those families to be engaged.
Yeah. Could you share a little bit about some of the common issues that you see in your work in and around schools?
I think the one theme that I see that is also a little bit disheartening is the lack of knowledge. The lack of knowledge, and that's from faculty and administrators to parents and guardians of families to students as well. There is a lack of knowledge about the protections that are out there that the PHRC that the PHRA, offers to students. And so I think that is one of my biggest efforts that I've been putting out is engaging with districts and engaging with families to make them aware of their rights and empowering students that even if they are children, that they still have rights and they still have the ability to use their voice to advocate for themselves, regardless of their age.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any really key misconceptions that you encounter a lot as you go about your work?
There's quite a few, but I think one of the biggest misconceptions around educational equity is this idea that equity is only focused on one thing. And a lot of conversation, it's always focused on race. And that's not to say that race is not critical. It absolutely is. It is the basis for how we ended up in these structural and systemic inequities today. You mentioned redlining at the beginning of our conversation. That was solely based on race, right? So we have to acknowledge race as a basis for some of these educational inequities, but that's not the only thing. We have students with disabilities, we have English language learners, we have migrant families. There is a variety. We have 10 protected classes that the PHRA offers and considers. So we need to be looking at all of those elements. We are multifaceted humans, and so we cannot silo any of these conversations around equity on one type of characteristic. We need to be looking at the variety of human that we have and that we are.
Yeah, there's so many different facets to the diversity that we find in Pennsylvania, so I absolutely appreciate you highlighting all of those aspects. I know the focus of our conversation today has been specifically around schools and housing, but as you mentioned earlier, your work at PHRC is much broader in terms of education and outreach. Could you share with our viewers who might be interested in learning more about PHRC, about some of the free resources and training programs that we do have to offer?
Absolutely. So we are, as I mentioned, a small but mighty agency, and so there really is no end to what we are willing to try to do as it relates to supporting our mission. Our mission is to eradicate discrimination in the Commonwealth. So if that is offering trainings, then we do that free of charge as Commonwealth employees, and we have a variety of trainings from fair housing, focuses, which you lead obviously and are very familiar with. We have our anti-discrimination types of trainings. We have our diversity types of trainings. We have our consciousness types of trainings, humility and humanity types of trainings. So really any type of discussion that points back to anti-discrimination, we are willing to have. Whatever type of training we're willing to curate with the requester. So that's one. We do a lot of outreach events. So we partner with a lot of communities on various types of events to, again, bring awareness, have these types of conversations, but also community building. We have an entire division devoted to that. And we have keynotes. We have Pretty much anything. I think if the request comes in, we will entertain it at least.
Yeah, absolutely. So this work is incredibly difficult. Could you share with us a little bit about what keeps you going in the face of challenging days?
The work never stops because the outcomes still reflect a need. So some days are hard. I think this work does sometimes show a very ugly side to humanity, but I also am not discouraged by that. I think some of the misconceptions out there are just simply a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding. And so until the disparities don't exist anymore, I'm going to keep doing this work. But I genuinely love the work too, even on the hard days, knowing that I am on the side of pursuing justice and equity for all human beings, for all human life. I sleep well. Maybe interrupted, but well.
Yeah, it's a powerful calling for sure. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show today. We really appreciate both you joining us and for the leadership that you bring to PHRC. And I'd also like to thank our viewers for spending their afternoon learning with us. If you believe that you've experienced housing discrimination or would like to learn more about housing protections in Pennsylvania, give us a call at PHRC's Fair Housing Line, which is 855-866-5718. You can also find us at our website on the screen, which is www.pa.gov/en/agencies/PHRC. You can also keep up with our work on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And remember, our communities are stronger when everyone has a place to call home. We'll see you next time.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.